I believe that we move on to Director Platchey is back up. Director Platchey, you ready to go?
Yes, thank you, President Tollefson. I am going to take a minute and share my screen. Okay, well, thank you again. This presentation is really sort of a two-part presentation. My part of the presentation is really to give you an idea of some of the section history and the composition of the sections as they stood in FY21, and then to talk about some of the activities, the scope of activities the sections are involved in. And then I expect that to take less than 20 minutes. And then our next segment of this presentation will involve some section leaders who are here to present their perspectives as a section member within the integrated bar. And those section members are Nancy Hawkins from the family law section, Kari Petrasic from the solo small practice section, Kevin Fay from the corporate counsel section, and Randy Wynn from the world peace through law section. So when I'm done, then our section leaders will be up to discuss their perspectives as section leaders within the integrated bar. So we have, for this presentation, and this is sort of the same kind of overview I went over before. The only thing different here is that the WSBA sections do provide a wide range of member benefits. And to demonstrate that, we created a chart that we are moving into here. That was developed from our section staff took the annual reports from each section for FY21 and developed this chart of section activities that each of the sections were engaged in FY21. And again, this is taken from the FY21 section annual reports. But before getting into discussing some of these activities that sections are engaged in, I wanted to go over the first few columns here in this chart, and that's the membership count. We did break down the membership count per section so that you can see how many members are associated with each section. The total in FY21 was 16,019 section members, and you can see they're allocated out among the various sections in the chart.
And history.
The next column is really the fund balance again for each section. So this is the fund balance as of the end of fiscal year 2021. And so the fund balance at the end of FY21 was sitting at a little over $1.5 million. And the balance, each individual section balance is provided in column 2. The section formation just gives a history of when the sections were formed with WSBA. So the first sections were formed in 1973, and they're in ranked order by date of formation is how they're stacked up here. So you can see as you scroll down, the last section was formed in 2017, which was the cannabis law section. From 2008 to 2017, 3 new sections were formed. We have a total of 29 sections. And then the section member dues are in the 4th column. And this is where they range. Section member dues range anywhere from $20. You can see health law charges $20, corporate counsel charges $20, and they go up to $40. So International practice charges 40, ELUL environmental land use charges 40, and then there's some in between that, 25, 30, and 35. But they range from 20, I'm sorry, this is moving. They range from $20 to $45. And then the number of EC members at the end of FY21, and EC is executive committee members, and the executive committee members are actually donating their time and volunteering their time to actually govern their section. And you can see here the count for each executive committee, section executive committee, and then the total among all 29 sections at the end of FY21, there were 369 executive committee members. In FY22, that number went up to 390. And then the balance of this chart really gets into the activities the sections were involved in FY21. And I wanted to point a couple of these out. So again, back to the prior presentation, you can see that CLE development is a very robust part of all the sections in one way or another. They either produce CLEs with WSBA under that fiscal split policy that I talked about earlier, or they engage in delivering mini CLEs. And so among those two formats, every section is engaged in the development of CLEs in one way or another. Legislation's interesting. In their annual reports, 9 of the sections reported that they engaged in legislative activity. I do want to point out that family law doesn't have a lot put into here, because I think this chart was developed at a time before the family law annual report got in, or and so you'll notice there's not a lot of X's for family law, even though they have. Family law is a very robust section that's involved in a broad scope of these activities, for sure CLEs, and I believe they engaged in legislative activity last year. So if you add them in, 9 sections engaged in reported that they engaged in some form of legislative activity out of the 29 sections. I went back and talked with Sanjay Walvakar, our legislative affairs manager, and he provided some information about sections commenting versus sections tracking. So there are way more sections that are tracking that WSBA is tracking legislation for than are commenting on legislation. So for instance, in FY22, Sanjay reported that 20 sections out of the 29 that we are tracking legislation for them. However, only 2 sections have requested to comment on legislation in the same time frame, and that is family law and low bono. So, and this historically is played out. Sections that took positions on legislation historically, and I've got the numbers back to FY18. In FY18, there were 6 sections that took a position on legislation. In FY19, there were 7 sections that took a position on legislation. In FY20, there were 7, and in FY21, there were 5. So I do think there's something to dig into a little more there in terms of sections that track or that WSBA tracks for. And Sanjay could probably provide a little more input into this, but my understanding is WSBA has a identifier, basically identifies legislation that may be relevant to a section and provides it to the section, and then gets feedback from them on whether they want to track legislation. And then sometimes sections affirmatively bring legislation to us. So while there's 20 sections that we're tracking for, a far few number actually comment. So I think that's something to point out. And then you can see across the activities. We put this in your materials. So it'll give you a good flavor of the other activities that sections engage in. Some have social media sites, many give scholarships and grants to law students and others. And then they participate in receptions and forums. Several produce newsletters, and every section has a listserv that they communicate on. And some do law school outreach, and then some partner with us in the development of desk books as well. So I think that gives a good representation of the activities that sections engage in. And I think that was the intent of my presentation, was just to give you a insight into the types of activities that the sections engage in and some history and composition of the sections. So I will end my presentation there and see if there's any questions.
Governor Adwale has his hand up.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mr. President. Kevin, are all the listservs hosted by WSBA on WSBA servers? Are all these listservs, because I noticed that virtually all these sections have listservs. Are those hosted by on WSBA servers? Thank you.
Most of them are, some aren't. I know family law has a listserv that's administered differently. So some of the sections have, most of the sections have listservs that are administered by WSBA. A few, though, don't.
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions for our Chief Advancement Director? Oh, Governor Stevens.
Sorry, Mr. President. Kevin, I was just curious because every time you said it, it didn't sound right to me. I thought there were some sections long ago that were established almost at the time we formed an association. There were no sections until 1973 whatsoever.
I don't believe so. I'm going to look to Julianne Unite, who's here as well. She's our Member Services and Engagement Manager. In our research, 1973 was when the first section was formed. Julianne, do you have anything additional to add?
I can add that I believe those dates originated from each individual section's bylaws. So there could be an instance where a section may have been formed but no longer exists and is no longer an active section. I don't have any of that information in front of me. I know we've had some sections that renamed themselves. I know, like, for example, the LGBT law section started out as the Sojali section. We also had a general practice section that I think ended up turning into solo and small practice, but all of these dates here are supported by each individual section's bylaws.
Governor Stevens, you have a follow-up question? I guess not.
No, thank you.
Any other questions?